Okinawa, spring 1945. The air, thick with the scent of damp earth, salt spray, and the acrid smoke of distant bombardments, clung to everything, heavy and oppressive. Corporal Tommy Miller, a young American infantryman from rural Iowa, his uniform perpetually sweat-soaked, cautiously led his squad through a tangled thicket of banyan trees. Each gnarled root seemed to grasp at their boots, each shadow potentially concealing an enemy. They were pushing deeper into territory held fiercely by the Imperial Japanese Army, an insidious, unseen adversary. Every step was a gamble against an unseen enemy, a silent prayer whispered into the humid air. The distant chatter of machine guns was a familiar symphony of dread, punctuated by the sharper crack of rifles and the dull thud of mortar fire. Tommy, whose hands had guided a plow through fertile Iowa soil just a few years prior, now gripped his M1 Garand with a weary but firm resolve, his knuckles white against the dark wood. His eyes, once accustomed to scanning horizons for cornfields, now meticulously swept every inch of the dense jungle for movement, for any sign of ambush. Suddenly, a faint metallic glint caught his eye. He froze, hand raised, signaling his squad to halt. Crouching low, he moved towards it, pushing aside a curtain of dripping leaves. There, half buried in the muddy churn of a shallow trench near a crumbling stone wall, lay a broken doll. Its porcelain face was cracked, one vacant eye staring skyward, its small cotton dress stained with grime and dried blood. It was a poignant, unsettling micro-detail, a stark reminder of innocence lost, brutalized, and forgotten in this savage landscape, a testament to the lives torn asunder by the relentless machinery of war. The fragility of the toy contrasted violently with the overwhelming, crushing weight of their current reality. Tommy felt a familiar ache in his chest, a fleeting image of his younger sister, Susie, and her own collection of dolls back home, safe and loved. He pushed the thought away, hardening his gaze. There was no room for sentimentality here. In a war designed to strip humanity from both combatant and civilian, a war that sought to reduce men to machines and women to commodities, a hidden facility designed for systematic dehumanization, would soon become the unlikely crucible where an act of profound, unexpected compassion would forge a new understanding of resilience and hope. It was a twist of fate as cruel as it was redemptive, a moment where the darkest corners of human depravity would be met with an incandescent spark of decency, proving that even amidst the savagery of conflict, the spirit of empathy could endure, and sometimes even triumph. As we delve into this harrowing yet ultimately redemptive chapter of World War II, we want to know, where are you watching this story from today? Share your location in the comments below, and prepare to question everything you thought you knew about the true cost of conflict and the power of a single word miles away, cloistered in a dimly lit, stiflingly hot office within the fortified perimeter of Shuri Castle, sat Captain Isamu Hayashi. He was a veteran officer of the Imperial Japanese Army, a man whose worldview was forged in the rigid doctrines of Bushido and fervent loyalty to the Emperor. His thin, ascetic face, etched with lines of discipline and fatigue, rarely betrayed emotion. He saw himself as an embodiment of Japan's divine mission, a soldier whose every breath was dedicated to the glory of the Empire. His actions, however brutal or controversial, were justified by this sacred duty, by the absolute necessity of preserving Japan's honor and expanding its sphere of influence across Asia. He found solace in the strict hierarchy and unyielding traditions of the military, believing implicitly in its divine purpose. Hayashi genuinely believed that the comfort women system, meticulously organized and ruthlessly implemented, was a necessary evil. He viewed it as a pragmatic solution to maintain soldier morale, to prevent what he considered disorderly conduct, and to control widespread sexual violence against local populations, a twisted, self-serving logic meticulously reinforced by years of state-sponsored propaganda. To him, it was a necessary cog in the vast, grinding machine of war, a regrettable but indispensable element for maintaining military effectiveness. He viewed the women, primarily Korean but also Chinese, Filipino, and others, as mere resources, their individual identities entirely subsumed by their designated, ignoble role. Their suffering was, in his cold calculations, a necessary sacrifice for the greater glory of the empire, a narrative he repeated to himself, a litany of justification designed to suppress any nascent doubt, any flicker of human empathy that might threaten his resolute conviction. He had long since learned to compartmentalize, to see statistics where there were once faces, to hear echoes where there were once screams. The air around the Comfort Station 731, a converted colonial-era building on the outskirts of Shuri, always carried a faint sickly sweet odor, a mix of stale sake, cheap disinfectant struggling to mask deeper, more offensive stenches, and something indescribable, deeply disturbing. It was the smell of fear, of despair, of systemic abuse that permeated the very stones of the building. Hayashi, passing by during his inspections, would sometimes catch a fleeting glimpse of gaunt faces behind barred windows, eyes like hollow pools reflecting nothing but terror, or hear a faint choked cry, quickly stifled from within. These momentary disturbances, these intrusions of stark reality, he summarily dismissed as the unavoidable byproducts of war. He had trained himself, through years of arduous mental conditioning, to filter out their humanity, to see them only as units in a system, as necessary components in a grand, terrible strategy. To acknowledge their pain was to acknowledge his own complicity, and that was a luxury he could not afford in his unwavering service to the Emperor. The patrol had been long and arduous, pushing through pockets of Japanese resistance that seemed to materialize from the very earth itself. Tommy's squad, having successfully neutralized a small, stubbornly entrenched Japanese machine gun nest that had pinned them down for hours, felt the adrenaline slowly recede, replaced by a profound exhaustion. They were low on ammunition, their nerves frayed. It was then, while conducting a sweep of the immediate area, that they stumbled upon the Comfort Station. The building, outwardly unassuming, a two-story structure with faded stucco walls and a heavy wooden door, seemed incongruous with the jungle war raging around them. There were no fortifications, no immediate signs of military personnel. Yet, an unsettling stillness hung about it, a pervasive quiet that felt wrong. As they cautiously entered, pushing open the creaking door, the interior assaulted their senses. The air was thick and stale, cloying with the lingering smell of unwashed bodies, cheap incense, and a cloying, indefinable sweetness that made Tommy's stomach churn. The light was dim, filtering through grime-streaked windows, revealing a stark, cavernous hall. There, huddled together on thin straw mats, were approximately 24 women. Their forms were gaunt, their clothing ragged and ill-fitting, eyes wide with a mixture of terror and resignation, staring out from hollow sockets. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by their ragged, shallow breathing and the distant echoes of battle. This was not a military barracks, nor a civilian shelter in the conventional sense. This was something far darker, something Tommy, in his Midwestern innocence, couldn't have conceived. Tommy felt a cold dread seize him, more profound than any fear he'd experienced on the battlefield. This wasn't combat. This wasn't even the brutality of armed prisoners of war. This was systematic, quiet horror, the raw, palpable fear in their eyes, the scars visible even in the dim light of the room, some physical, others etched deeper into their very beings, immediately conveyed a horror beyond anything he had witnessed in combat. His immediate thought was not of enemy combatants, nor of strategic objectives, but of the women back home, his sisters, his mother. His rifle felt heavy, suddenly useless, inadequate in this context. It felt wrong to hold a weapon, to exude aggression in a place steeped in such vulnerability. He found himself lowering it slightly, a gesture of instinctive deference. Among the group, Tommy quickly discerned that there were 23 women, predominantly Korean, though some appeared to be Chinese and Filipino. They were trapped, living nightmares, part of an estimated 200,000 to 400,000 comfort women forced into sexual slavery by the Imperial Japanese Army across Asia during the war. This chilling figure, a stark indictment of wartime atrocities, would only begin to surface in its full scope years later. The sheer scale of the suffering represented by these women was almost unfathomable. A declassified official after-action report from the U.S. 1st Marine Division, filed months after the Battle of Okinawa, and slowly surfacing in historical archives decades later, tersely noted in its internal assessment. Section 4, page 12, Report 077, Okinawa. Discovered comfort station facility, containing numerous female non-combatants. Conditions observed: severe deprivation, psychological trauma. Immediate medical and psychological assistance required. The clinical language of the report barely scratched the surface of the human devastation Tommy and his men had just encountered. As Private Jenkins, the squad medic, a quiet man with kind eyes from rural Georgia, cautiously approached, one young woman, barely more than a girl, perhaps 17 or 18, flinched violently. Her name, they would later learn, was Lee Hana. Her body tensed, recoiling as if struck, a deeply ingrained response to the approach of any uniform. Yet amidst her profound fear, her gaze was drawn, almost hypnotically, to the small embroidered American flag patch on Jenkins's sleeve. It was a tiny, vibrant splash of color against the drab olive green. There was a flicker of something almost like curiosity in her eyes, a fleeting moment of analytical observation amidst the terror, a spark of inquiry in a soul long taught only to endure. This small detail, the simple symbol of a nation so far away, seemed to offer a fragile promise of something different, something outside the suffocating reality she had known. The discovery of the women led to a grim inventory of their suffering. Investigations that followed the war would reveal, with horrifying precision, the scale of their daily torment. These women had been subjected to an average of 10-20 sessions per day, 7 days a week, often for years, a relentless cycle of abuse designed to break body and spirit. This brutal regimen led to devastating rates of venereal diseases, chronic infections, crippling infertility, and a host of chronic physical ailments that went largely untreated by their captors. The Japanese military, despite its meticulous record-keeping in other areas, considered the women's health secondary, providing only the most rudimentary, often ineffective medical attention, viewing them as disposable assets. A chilling entry in a recovered Japanese military ledger, detailing the logistical operations of the Imperial Army in the Okinawa sector, offered a stark, dehumanizing glimpse into the system. Under the heading Comfort Station Logistics, Okinawa Sector, a recent entry read, "Daily allocation for special services increased. Request for more prophylactic supplies denied. Continue as scheduled." The cold bureaucratic language stood in stark contrast to the human tragedy it represented, reducing suffering to a line item, life to a quantifiable resource. The sheer exhaustion etched into Hana's face, a weariness beyond mere physical fatigue, was profound. It spoke of a spirit pushed to its absolute limit, stripped bare by endless torment, a soul stretched thin by the daily fight for survival. Yet even in her profound weariness, a tiny spark of life, of observation, remained. It was that spark that had latched onto the flag patch, a testament to an inner resilience that refused to be entirely extinguished, even by the most brutal of circumstances. Tommy, his heart aching with an unfamiliar mixture of anger and profound pity, decided to try a different approach. He knew aggressive gestures would only provoke more fear. He slowly reached into his pack, pulling out a K-ration biscuit, a bland, hard tack, but a staple of their meager diet. He held it out, his hand open and unarmed, his expression as gentle as he could make it, trying to communicate through gestures what words could not yet convey. Hana hesitated, her eyes flicking between the biscuit and Tommy's face, searching for any hint of threat. Then slowly, tentatively, she reached out, her fingers trembling as she took the offering. The simple act of receiving a gift, given without expectation of payment or violence, was a foreign concept, a memory long buried beneath layers of abuse. The very simplicity of the gesture seemed to disarm her, if only for a moment. The stories of how these women came to be in such places were uniformly tragic. International human rights organizations and historians would later meticulously document these abductions. Many of these women, overwhelmingly young, were lured from their homes, often under false pretenses of factory work, nursing positions, or administrative roles in distant cities. Some were as young as 13 or 14 years old, snatched from childhoods that had barely begun, enduring an average of 3 to 5 years of forced servitude, before the rare chance of liberation or the more common fate of death from disease, malnutrition, or despair. Their families, desperate and often impoverished, were often powerless to resist the deceit or the brute force of military recruitment. From the testimony of Kim Bok-dong, a revered comfort woman survivor who bravely spoke out for decades, a chilling echo resonated. They said, "Come to Japan, good job. My family was starving." I believed them. Then the real nightmare began on the ship. Her words, representative of countless others, painted a picture of calculated deception and systematic exploitation, highlighting the calculated cruelty of a system that preyed on vulnerability. The biscuit was bland, dry, and almost tasteless, a mere sustenance ration. But the act behind it, the gentle, unthreatening gesture of offering, brought a fragile tear to Hana's eye. It was a tear that felt alien after so long without genuine human kindness, a testament to the unexpected rupture of her hardened shell. It was a tear not of sorrow, but of a momentary, almost unbearable relief, a fragile acknowledgement that perhaps, just perhaps, not all men were monsters. Among the women, another figure stood out. She was older, perhaps in her late 30s or early 40s, her hair streaked prematurely with gray, her face a map of suffering. As the Americans tried to organize them, she remained withdrawn, clutching something tightly in her palm, hidden from view. Later, when the initial fear began to recede, Hana saw it, a small, faded jade charm, worn smooth by countless touches. It was a last remnant of her former life, a tangible piece of her identity, a silent rebellion against the erasure she had endured. It was a potent symbol, a refusal to be utterly dehumanized. She had kept it hidden, risking severe punishment, a testament to the enduring power of personal connection and memory. The psychological trauma inflicted upon the comfort women was immense, a wound that would never truly heal for the survivors. Studies conducted decades later by mental health professionals and historians painted a grim picture. Over 80% of comfort women survivors suffered from severe, lifelong post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, chronic depression, complex trauma, and deep-seated anxiety. These conditions permeated every aspect of their lives, making it almost impossible to form lasting relationships, to trust, or to find peace. The scars were not just on their bodies, but etched irrevocably into their minds and souls. A confidential assessment from a U.S. Army psychiatrist, Dr. Eleanor Vance, part of a post-war study on civilian detainees, provided early insight into the depth of the damage. In Psychological Impact, Civilian Detainees, 1946, she wrote, "Subjects demonstrate profound distrust, emotional numbing, severe attachment disorders, and a profound sense of self-worthlessness. Rehabilitation will be extensive and protracted, requiring specialized long-term care far beyond the scope of immediate post-conflict aid." Her words foreshadowed the decades of silent suffering many of these women would endure. Seeing the jade charm, so similar to a small, intricate necklace his own grandmother wore back in Iowa, Tommy felt a surge of profound empathy. The universality of such a small, personal anchor, a link to home and identity, even in the midst of this unique horror, struck him deeply. It was a common thread that transcended language, culture, and the vast chasm of their experiences. This realization deepened his resolve, confirming in his mind that these were not just nameless victims, but individuals, each with a story, each deserving of protection. He saw his grandmother, his sisters, his own humanity reflected in the small, worn stone. Just as Tommy's squad, having established a fragile rapport and convinced the terrified women to begin moving towards a safer, more defensible position, further from the main battle lines, prepared to make their retreat, disaster struck. Captain Hayashi, having been alerted by a reconnaissance patrol that had spotted the American detachment near the comfort station, launched a swift and brutal counterattack. His objective, however, wasn't merely to reclaim the facility or engage the enemy in a conventional battle. His primary goal was far more chilling: to eliminate all evidence. For Hayashi, the survival of these women meant dishonor for the Imperial Army, a potential stain on Japan's meticulously constructed wartime narrative of purity and purpose. Their existence, if discovered by the Allies, would be a catastrophic propaganda defeat, a testament to a cruelty the Japanese high command fervently wished to conceal. They were not to be rescued. They were to be erased. The sound of rapidly approaching footsteps, the distinctive clatter of Japanese rifles, and the guttural shouts of commands echoed through the jungle. Tommy instantly understood the gravity of the situation. The Americans weren't just liberators. They were now active protectors, thrust into a desperate defense against an enemy intent on burying its own victims. This transformed a straightforward rescue into a desperate, morally charged standoff. It was no longer about securing territory or neutralizing combatants. It was about shielding the utterly vulnerable from a calculated act of ideological extermination, a last-ditch effort by Hayashi to salvage the perceived honor of his unit and conceal a ghastly secret from the world. The jungle, once a neutral backdrop, now became a claustrophobic cage where the lines between combat and atrocity blurred irrevocably. Tommy faced an immediate, profound ethical dilemma, one that transcended the standard rules of engagement. His standing orders were to secure the area, neutralize enemy threats, and avoid unnecessary risks that could compromise the larger strategic objective of taking Okinawa. However, protecting these vulnerable women now directly conflicted with strict military protocols that often prioritized strategic objectives over individual lives, especially non-combatant lives that weren't explicitly part of their mission parameters. To abandon them meant condemning them to certain death at the hands of Hayashi's men, who viewed them as mere liabilities to be erased, human evidence of unforgivable crimes. This was no longer just about fighting an enemy on the battlefield. It was about defining what it meant to be human in the crucible of war, about drawing a moral line in the bloody sand. His decision, an instinctive one to shield them, to place his men and himself between the women and the approaching Japanese soldiers, would defy the callousness of conflict and assert a universal moral imperative. It was a choice made not from doctrine, but from a gut-level sense of right and wrong, a fundamental refusal to allow further suffering when he possessed the means to prevent it. He saw not anonymous non-combatants, but suffering individuals, terrified and helpless. The confrontation highlighted the emerging, yet still largely unwritten ethical frameworks around war crimes and the treatment of non-combatants. The systematic sexual enslavement represented a profound violation of human dignity, a precursor to later understandings of crimes against humanity. Tommy's choice, a raw, almost primal refusal to allow further atrocity, was an embryonic act of moral courage, anticipating international legal precedents that would only solidify decades later with the Geneva Conventions and the Nuremberg trials. It demonstrated that even without formal legal mandates, the human spirit could, and often did, recognize and fight against egregious injustice. His men, observing his unwavering resolve, instinctively followed, understanding that some lines were not to be crossed. The direct outcome of his choice was not just their immediate physical safety, but a powerful affirmation of their inherent worth, an assertion that their lives mattered, regardless of their nationality or their captors' dehumanizing labels. Every single casualty and injury sustained by his squad during this desperate defense would be inextricably linked to this assertion of human value, a testament to the idea that protecting innocence, even in the face of overwhelming odds, was a moral imperative that superseded tactical expediency. They were fighting not just for territory, but for the very soul of humanity. The ensuing firefight was a desperate, chaotic struggle, a maelstrom of violence that threatened to engulf everything. Tommy's small squad, numbering barely a dozen men, found themselves heavily outnumbered by Hayashi's determined assault. They fortified themselves within the crumbling compound, using overturned tables, splintered chairs, and even the women's meager belongings to create makeshift barricades. Each American fought with a ferocity born not just of survival, but of protecting the innocent cowering behind them, their backs literally and metaphorically against the wall. They laid down suppressive fire, their M1s barking, their Browning automatic rifle chattering a desperate rhythm, using every available piece of cover, every angle, to slow the Japanese advance. The air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder, the ping of ricocheting bullets, and the frantic shouts of both sides. Hana, witnessing the American soldiers risking their lives for them, for women whom the world had forgotten or deliberately ignored, felt a flicker of defiance she thought long extinguished. The terror was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now tempered by a burgeoning sense of gratitude, of fierce protectiveness. She rallied the other women, her voice, though soft, carrying an unexpected authority. "Help! We must help!" she urged, motioning for them to push furniture against the doors, to drag injured American soldiers into safer corners, to retrieve dropped magazines. Her small acts of courage, her newfound resolve, echoed the soldiers' larger, more lethal fight, a desperate symphony of survival. From Captain Hayashi's perspective, this was not just a skirmish, but a battle to preserve the honor of the Imperial Army, a necessary evil to erase an inconvenient truth. He pushed his men relentlessly, screaming commands, demanding the swift elimination of the evidence. Their attack was precise, merciless, driven by a fanatical loyalty and a desperate need to conceal their crimes. He saw only the strategic imperative, the need to prevent humiliation. But from Tommy's perspective, it was a battle for absolute humanity, a visceral refusal to let the women be swallowed by the dark tide of war. He moved among his men, shouting orders, offering encouragement, his own fear subsumed by a fierce determination. As the battle reached its crescendo, the Japanese troops breaching the outer perimeter, Tommy, amidst the deafening gunfire and the screams, saw Hana pull a younger woman, injured by shrapnel, out of harm's way, shielding her with her own body. He knew, with absolute certainty, that he could not let these women fall back into the hands of their tormentors. He risked exposing himself to lay down covering fire, emptying a clip, screaming at his men to hold the line, his voice hoarse with exertion and fury. It was in that moment, as the American soldiers fought with grim, desperate determination, their faces streaked with mud and blood, that one of them, Private Rodriguez, a burly, usually quiet man from Texas, looked at the trembling women huddled in a corner, their eyes wide with renewed terror. Overwhelmed by the horror he had witnessed and by their desperate courage, he instinctively shouted, his voice cracking with emotion, "Don't worry, sisters. You're safe now." The word, sisters, resonated amidst the chaos, cutting through the din of battle, a declaration of kinship, of profound, unequivocal protection. It was a word that transformed them from nameless victims into family, into human beings worthy of fighting for. Hayashi, watching from a distance as his attack faltered under the unexpected ferocity of the American defense, heard that word, sisters, distinctly, carried on the wind. A profound, almost primal shame washed over him, a sense of moral defeat far greater than any tactical loss. The sight of his enemy fighting for those he had deemed disposable, for those he sought to erase, shattered his rigid worldview, his carefully constructed justifications. The Americans had acknowledged their humanity where he had denied it. The very foundation of his belief system crumbled in that moment, a sudden, searing realization of the grotesque hypocrisy of his actions. He saw his men falter, their zeal dampened by the unexpected resistance, by the sheer, unyielding moral force confronting them. The attack receded, its momentum broken not just by bullets, but by a single, powerful word. With the immediate threat neutralized, the last Japanese remnants fading back into the jungle, an eerie quiet settled over the battered compound. The American soldiers, their faces streaked with grime, sweat, and relief, moved carefully, their weapons still at the ready, but their postures softened. They gently helped the women, many still trembling, onto waiting transport trucks that had been called in by radio, a lifeline connecting them to the outside world. At a makeshift field hospital set up deeper within the secured American perimeter, they received their first proper medical care in years, rudimentary by civilian standards, but a monumental leap from the neglect they had endured. Along with medical attention, they were given clean clothes, nourishing food, and, perhaps most importantly, compassionate human contact that acknowledged their suffering without judgment. Hana finally seated on a clean cot, wrapped in a warm blanket, the taste of real food in her mouth felt an overwhelming release. The sheer burden of years of fear and abuse, the constant vigilance, the crushing despair, suddenly lifted. She collapsed into deep, shuddering sobs, not of terror, but of an overwhelming, cathartic release. It was the sound of a spirit finally breaking free, a torrent of pent-up grief and gratitude. The immediate, tangible relief was immense, but the road to full physical and psychological recovery, the long journey back to themselves, would be arduous, fraught with unseen challenges, requiring strength she wasn't sure she still possessed. While this particular incident was one among many, stories of the liberation of comfort women by Allied forces, sometimes anecdotal, sometimes officially documented, began to filter through unofficial channels. Later, as more reports surfaced and testimonies were collected, these individual narratives contributed to a growing, albeit agonizingly slow, awareness within the international community. It was a small but significant ripple that, over the decades, would swell into a global movement advocating for recognition, apology, and justice for these survivors. The actions of Tommy and his squad, and others like them, began to lay groundwork for future human rights activism concerning wartime sexual violence, slowly forcing the world to confront an uncomfortable truth. They were tiny cracks in a wall of silence, but through them light began to shine. 70 years later, the world had changed beyond recognition. A dignified, silver-haired Lee Hana, her face lined with the passage of time but her eyes still holding a profound depth, stood before the General Assembly of the United Nations in New York. She was no longer the terrified girl in Okinawa, but a revered human rights activist, her voice steady and clear, amplified by decades of tireless advocacy. She recounted her harrowing ordeal, her testimony a powerful echo of countless others, but she also spoke of the profound, transformative moment when an American soldier, Private Rodriguez, in the chaos of battle, called her sister. She emphasized how that single word, that unsolicited act of recognition and solidarity, had ignited a spark of hope and resilience within her, a spark that had fueled her lifelong fight for justice and remembrance. Her testimony, translated into countless languages, served as a powerful, living echo, reminding the world that even in the darkest chapters of history, acts of human kindness, however small, could create a legacy that challenged nations to confront their past and strive for a more just and humane future. Her words were a testament to the enduring power of empathy, a beacon of hope against the shadows of historical atrocity. In the shadow of unspeakable cruelty, it was the simple, profound humanity of a single word, sisters, that illuminated the path to healing and justice, transforming victims into survivors and inspiring a lifelong fight for truth. How do we ensure that such acts of dehumanization are never forgotten, that the lessons of history are truly learned, and what is our collective responsibility to recognize, support, and uplift those whose voices have been systematically silenced by conflict and oppression, both in the past and in the present? If this story resonated with you, if it stirred your empathy and challenged your perspective on the hidden corners of history, please hit that subscribe button. Join our community as we continue to unearth and share the untold, forgotten, and often difficult stories from World War II. Narratives of courage, compassion, and the indomitable human spirit that demand to be heard, understood, and remembered for generations to come.